Welcome to the endocrine system. Welcome to the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the body's second great controlling system, which influences metabolic activities of cells by means of hormones. So basically, all of our body's activities are controlled through our hormones. The endocrine system works with the nervous system in order to coordinate activity with body cells. There are 9 major organs in the endocrine system: the pineal gland, hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenals, pancreas, and ovaries or testes. Here is the location of the 9 major organs that I just mentioned. Feel free to push pause if you want to get a closer look at them. Hormones are chemical messengers that are released into the bloodstream. So once they're released, they will circulate throughout our blood and deliver these hormones to all the cells in our body. Although hormones do circulate the bloodstream, they only affect specific cells, and we call these target cells. Target cells are a specific cell that contains a receptor for specific hormones to bind to and react with. So for example, the thyroid stimulating hormone, it will circulate our entire bloodstream, but it will only bind to the thyroid receptors on the thyroid gland because that is where those receptors are located. So the thyroid stimulating hormone is not going to bind to our pancreas or any other gland. It is only going to bind specifically with that target cell. So some of the effects of hormones on target cells. There are 2 major types of hormones. There are steroid hormones as well as peptide hormones. Steroid hormones are considered lipids, and they are special because they actually diffuse across the cell membrane and go directly into the target cell. Once they're in the target cell, they will bind to the receptor proteins inside of that cell and do whatever function that they are supposed to do. There are 5 classes of steroid hormones. There are androgens and estrogen, which are responsible for sexual development characteristics of both females and males. There are progestins, which mediate the menstrual cycle and pregnancy in females. There are mineralocorticoids, which help to regulate the excretion or release of salt and water by our kidneys. And then there are glucocorticoids, which produce an inflammatory reaction, and also helps us to deal with stressful situations. So the action of these steroid hormones are as follows, and the picture follows the same steps that I'm going to walk you through. So the first step is the hormone actually diffuses through the plasma membrane, again, because it is lipid soluble, so it can pass into the target cell. That hormone is going to bind to the receptor inside of the nucleus. Once it's inside of the nucleus, the hormone receptor complex will activate transcription. And if you recall from biology, that is where you are making a copy of DNA, but it is in the form of mRNA or messenger RNA. From there, the mRNA would move to the ribosome because that's the location of protein synthesis. And then those proteins, which include enzymes, are going to promote specific metabolic activities. Peptide hormones, on the other hand, are how the majority of all of our hormones are classified. These are going to act as the boss or the directors of the workers, and they do not enter the target cells. So the actions of the hormones are following the image as I go through these as well. The hormone is going to bind to the receptor on the plasma membrane, so it's outside of the target cell. The binding of that is going to lead to the activation of an enzyme that changes ATP into CAMP. The CAMP is going to activate what we call an enzyme cascade, so an overflow of these enzymes working. Many molecules are going to be built or broken down, and then they will also enter into the bloodstream. Then we get into our feedback mechanisms as it relates to hormones. So a negative feedback mechanism is meant to reverse the original stimulus. This is what most of our homeostatic control mechanisms are classified as. Its goal is to shut off or reduce the intensity of the original stimulus. So as you see in the circle here, we can see that our conditions in the body change from a set point. A change is detected, corrective mechanisms are activated, the conditions return back to the set point, and then the corrective mechanisms are switched off once the body returns back to the original set point. So hormone secretions are triggered by either an internal or an external stimulus. As the hormone levels increase, cells become inhibited. As the hormone levels decrease, those cells are stimulated. So again, the whole goal is to return our body back to its normal state of being. Some examples of negative feedback mechanisms are our body temperature regulating. So we will sweat to reduce heat, we will shiver to build heat, withdrawal reflex, control of the volume of our blood, our heart rate, our blood pressure, the depth of our breathing, our oxygen levels in the blood, carbon dioxide levels in the blood, nutrients in the blood, and so on and so forth. Again, majority of all of our mechanisms in our body are negative feedback. An example of positive feedback is going to be where this causes the variable to change in the same direction as the initial disturbance. So it's going to enhance or it's going to accelerate the original stimulus. Typically, this controls infrequent events in the body, such as when a baby is being born and labor contractions are supposed to push the baby out, so they continue to get stronger and stronger and stronger until the baby is born. Clotting of our blood. So our blood clotting factors will actually kind of rush to the area in order to clot the blood. And then lactation production. So as long as the baby is still drinking milk from the mother, the milk will still be produced. So the positive feedback mechanism that we mentioned, one of them was blood clotting. So I want you to see a visual of what actually happens. So feel free to pause this so you can look through this image. Another one that I mentioned was childbirth. So the head of the baby is going to push against the cervix. The nerve impulses are going to be sent to the brain. The brain is going to tell the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin is carried to the uterus. The oxytocin stimulates the uterus to continue to contract and pushes the baby's head into the cervix. And this will continue to get stronger and stronger and stronger until the baby is born. And then there is no longer a baby head pushing against the cervix. So the childbirth cycle of oxytocin will stop. Endocrine glands have different types of stimulus. So they're stimulated to make and release their hormones by three major types of stimulus. The first one is humoral. This would be response to levels of nutrients in the bloodstream. So for example, as our sodium levels decrease, aldosterone would be secreted into our bloodstream to help to raise those levels back up. The second one is neural. So this is where the nerves are going to stimulate the release of the hormone. For example, epinephrine, which is the adrenaline hormone, would be released from the sympathetic nervous system in a fight or flight scenario. So when you need to shut off all non-major functions to get out of a situation, that would be a neural response. And then hormonal is our body's response to other hormones. So for example, the pituitary gland would release hormones that then trigger the release of testosterone, for example. Now with endocrine system, there are some disorders that can occur through either the hypersecretion of a hormone or a hyposecretion of a hormone. The hypersecretion is the excessive release of a hormone. So it's secreting too much of that hormone. Hyposecretion would be the inadequate release of the hormone. So it's not secreting enough of that hormone. The hypothalamus is the major link between the nervous and the endocrine system. So it is actually considered part of both of those body systems. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland and also the release of their own hormones. So the hormones that the hypothalamus secretes are the following 5. Corticotropic releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, and the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. They're actually produced here, even though they are released by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is the little gland that you see dangling from right here, and then this is the hypothalamus. So they're very close relation to one another. So the pituitary gland is broken into 2 sections, the anterior pituitary as well as the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary gland secretes 7 different hormones that are controlled by the hypothalamus. These are the 7 different hormones that the anterior pituitary gland secretes. The first one is thyroid stimulating hormone, and you'll notice that a lot of these have abbreviations. This controls the secretion of the thyroid hormones by the thyroid gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormones, or ACTH, are going to stimulate the adrenal glands to secrete cortisol as a result of stress. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to help with the development of eggs and the secretion of estrogen in females, and then the production of sperm in males. Luteinizing hormone is going to help with the secretion of estrogen and progesterone in females, as well as stimulating ovulation. Males, this will stimulate testosterone. The human growth hormone is going to stimulate bone and muscle growth. Prolactin is going to stimulate production of milk in females. And then melanocyte stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the melanocytes to secrete melanin to darken skin and or our hair. The posterior pituitary gland secretes 2 different hormones, again controlled by the hypothalamus. And these include oxytocin, which stimulates uterine contractions, and antidiuretic hormone, which is going to stop the production of urine. The thyroid gland, again, is controlled by the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. The thyroid gland releases 2 hormones, T3, or triiodothyronine, and T4, thyroxine. This gland is also responsible for our body's metabolism, and it also is necessary to have iodine in order to produce the T3 and T4 hormones. So you can see the visual aid that is on this slide of how when homeostasis is disturbed, what would happen to the cascade of hormones following that cycle in order to return it back to its normal state. The parathyroid glands are actually located on top of the thyroid glands. This helps to control calcium levels in our bloodstream. So with the effects of the parathyroid gland, if our levels of calcium are too high in the bloodstream, then the thyroid gland actually secretes calcitonin into the blood. So the calcitonin is going to stimulate the osteoblasts, remember the bone builders, to actually take calcium in from the bloodstream and store it into the bones. So this would actually lower the levels of calcium in the bloodstream because your bones have taken in that excess calcium. When the calcium levels are low in the bloodstream, the parathyroid gland will secrete the parathyroid hormone into the bloodstream. This will then stimulate the osteoclasts, remember the bone breakers, to break down bone, so it would release that stored calcium into the bloodstream, which in turn would increase our calcium levels in our blood. So that is shown in the diagram as well, if you want to pause and take another look. The adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys, and these are responsible for producing hormones that impact our development and our growth, our ability to deal with stress, as well as to help to regulate the kidney functions. So it makes sense that they sit right on top of the kidneys. Now, there are two parts to the adrenal glands. There is the cortex, which you can see is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. And then there is the medulla, which is the inner portion of the adrenal gland. So as you see me going through the different hormones, I will refer to which part of the adrenal gland that it is responsible for producing. Aldosterone is a hormone that the adrenal glands secrete from the cortex, and this will increase the sodium and the water levels while also decreasing potassium levels in the bloodstream. Cortisol is also released from the cortex, and this will increase the breakdown of protein, and this one is also released in response to stress. Androgens is responsible for the growth of pubic and axillary hair and is secreted by the cortex. And then epinephrine and norepinephrine are the two adrenal hormones from the sympathetic nervous system during a fight or flight situation. And this is going to be secreted from the medulla of the adrenal glands. So how these two all these hormones work together is as follows. And you can pause and look at the diagram as well. So when we have levels of sodium that are low in the bloodstream, oftentimes this is associated with a low blood pressure. So our kidneys are going to secrete something called renin into our bloodstream, which then is going to stimulate angiotensin 1 and 2. This will then stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. The whole purpose of this is that it causes the kidneys to actually reabsorb the sodium and the water from the kidneys, which is going to return it to the bloodstream. As a result, this will also increase our blood pressure. When levels of sodium are too high in the bloodstream, oftentimes this is associated with a high blood pressure. It can cause the blood pressure to rise, which is going to trigger the heart to release a hormone called the atrial natriuretic hormone, or also called ANH for short. This hormone will inhibit or stop the secretion of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. The kidneys will then excrete or release the sodium and the water through the urine, and then the blood pressure will actually decrease, making the sodium levels and the blood pressure return back to normal. Our pancreas is part of two systems as well, the endocrine system as well as the digestive system. It is responsible for glucose levels in the blood, so the sugar levels. Now, there are two parts of the pancreas. There are alpha cells, and then there are beta cells. It's just the types of cells that the pancreas is made up of. Glucagon is the hormone that the alpha cells will release, and this will raise the glucose levels in the blood. Insulin is going to be released by the beta cells, and this actually lowers glucose levels in the blood. So if you want to also pause this, you can watch or look at the diagram and see the cascade of events that follows as well once a disturbance has been introduced. The ovaries are a female reproductive organ, and they are responsible for secreting estrogen and progesterone, which are going to work with the pituitary gland to help to regulate the female cycle, as well as those secondary sex characteristics. So things that you get during puberty. Relaxin helps to dilate the cervix during birth, so opening it up so the baby can actually fit through. And inhibin will stop the production of oocytes, or stop the production of eggs. Now, ovarian cycles are very complex. So there are 3 phases that you can pause this video and look at depending on what part of the cycle the female is in. So there is the follicular phase. There is ovulation, where the egg is actually released. And then there is the luteal phase, which is after that. The pluses mean that that hormone is stimulated to produce more, and the negatives mean that it is inhibited or slows down the production of. So pause this and take a look, and then you can continue on the next slide. Testes are male reproductive organs, and they secrete testosterone, which stimulates the production of both sperm and the secondary sex characteristics. And inhibin stops the production of sperm. This is the cycle of the testes with both the luteinizing hormones as well as the follicle stimulating hormones as it relates to both producing sperm and those secondary sex characteristics. Again, a negative means it is slowing down or inhibiting. A positive means that it is increasing or producing more of. The pineal gland is located inside of the brain. And again, this is part of both the endocrine and the nervous system as well. This is responsible for our sleep and wake cycles. So it's going to secrete melatonin, which is actually always being secreted. It's just that when it gets darker, it will be secreted more. When it gets lighter, it will be secreted less. The thymus is an interesting endocrine gland because it plays a role in secreting hormones that are actually associated with our immunity. They produce T cells, which are called lymphocytes in the immune system. It's much larger in children because they're still building up their immunity. And this gland actually decreases in size as we get older. It secretes thymosin, which is going to stimulate the development of the T cells. And a few extra hormones are, one is leptin. So leptin is a peptide hormone that is produced by our adipose tissue. Remember, that's our fat tissue. And this actually acts on the hypothalamus, which plays a critical role in our appetite as well as our weight control. So you can see the diagram. As we intake our food, the fat tissue will stimulate leptin in order to tell our brain that we've had enough. And then we would decrease our eating and so on and so forth. It's kind of thought to have 2 major functions. The first one is that it's going to cross the blood-brain barrier and it's going to bind to receptors in our appetite center of our brain. And it's going to regulate those brain cells to tell us that we have had enough to eat. The second is that it increases the sympathetic nervous system, remember the fight or flight system, which stimulates the fatty tissue to burn energy. Another hormone is oxytocin, which is only significant to childbirthing females. And this will stimulate the uterus to contract and act on the breast to produce what we call the milk ejection or milk letdown. So the initial the initial time that a female has milk come out of her breast, that is stimulated by oxytocin. Now, the continuation of it is something else. And then the last hormone is prolactin. So after the initial milk has been released from the oxytocin, the continued production of milk is going to depend on the suckling of the nipple from the baby. And this is going to be the prolactin hormone. So it is released into the bloodstream during pregnancy from the pituitary gland, and it does stimulate the production of milk, but it is only let down or available to the baby after it's been delivered and the oxytocin has allowed it to be released. So it is secreted more at night for whatever reason, but it also suppresses ovulation. So it helps to prevent a female from becoming pregnant again while they are nursing a child, but it is not always foolproof.